Hello and welcome to another edition of Ideological, where we make learning arousing. Today we're talking about life in the Middle Ages. What could be more arousing than that? Sometimes people ask me, because I'm a big intellectual history guy, in what time period would I most want to live? And my answer, maybe it'd be fun to live during the Middle Ages and be a knight, or maybe it'd be fun to live during the Roman Empire and be a gladiator or something like this. My answer is a little less fun than that, and my answer is today. If I could choose any period of world history in which to live, it would actually probably be the future. I don't want to live back in the day before like anesthesia, where you could get like a cavity and it could kill you. I don't want to live back where like if you have a fever, they cut you and bleed you out to try to get rid of the hot, bad blood. I don't want that. So I want to live either now or in the future when we have a cure for cancer or something like that. And so today we're talking about a very difficult time to live, which would have been the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages there's some really great things about it. And there's some really like romantic things about it. And we have this idea of chivalry and knights and kings and all that stuff is really cool. And then there's also all the terrible stuff. And so we're going to talk about what would it have been like if you were just someone in the Middle Ages. If you were just a farmer or a peasant or something like that in the Middle Ages, what would life have been like? Now, before we get into this lecture, I need to say this. Even calling it the Middle Ages or the medieval period, which means the same thing, the middle period, or the Dark Ages, all these are actually pejorative terms that were developed during the Enlightenment. The idea was that there was intellectual flourishing in Greece, in the Greco-Roman world. And then you got medieval Christian Europe where nothing really developed and nothing was really awesome and there wasn't intellectual or scientific or artistic flourishing. And so it's just kind of in the middle of the ancient world and then the Enlightenment, where you have new, discoveries in science and philosophy and physics and all these kind of things. And so this term of Middle Ages or Dark Ages is pejorative. It's meant to say that there was awesome Greek stuff, awesome Enlightenment stuff, and this stuff in the middle, yuck. Okay, so it is a pejorative term that has become pretty common, but that's where it comes from. Now, I disagree with the pejorative connotation of these terms because there was actually a lot of intellectual flourishing in the Middle Ages. For example, you have the invention of, the university. That came about in the Middle Ages. So when you want to talk about academic, you want to talk about intellectual flourishing, you had the University of Bologna, not the stuff you put on a sandwich, in 1088 in Italy, University of Oxford in 1096 in England, the University of Salamanca, I almost said salmonella or something else like that, 1134 in Spain. You have the University of Paris, which will be enormously influential, about 1160-ish, 1150-ish. There's kind of it's kind of sketchy on when it exactly started in France, University of Cambridge, maybe you've heard of it, 1209 in England, et cetera, et cetera. So you have the invention of the university. So it's hard to make a case that there wasn't intellectual flourishing when the institution that we even have today, that is all about intellectual flourishing, at least it used to be. Today it's about indoctrination, but it used to be about intellectual flourishing and the arts and learning and thinking for yourself, not thinking like everybody else. It's changed, but it used to be that. That started in the medieval period. You also had an incredible list of intellectual and artistic figures. I'll give you just a few. There's more than this. Geoffrey Chaucer, maybe you've heard of him, author of the Canterbury Tales. Marco Polo, the guy that invented that fun swimming pool game where you close your eyes and hit your head on the concrete on the side of the pool. Anselm, Dante, Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, the inventor of bacon. I'm joking. Peter Abelard, Peter Lombard, William of Ockham, Albertus Magnus, Chrétien de Troyes, the author of Lancelot. Maybe you've heard of that. Geoffrey of Monmouth, the author of King Arthur. Maybe you've heard of that. John Duns Scotus, the subtle doctor, and others. Okay, so this was a time of tremendous intellectual flourishing. And that was just mentioning some things in like literature and philosophy and things like that. There were also famous works of art happening at this time, and paintings and sculptures and all this kind of stuff. So today we're going to be talking about life in the Middle Ages. Now, if you have to give just an overly simple, crass summary of what this time period is, this is 500 CE to about 1500 CE. Scholars disagree on exactly the year that we should consider the Middle Ages to have started, or but that's a good crass summary. So it's about 1,000-year period in Western history. So it's a huge chunk of time, this Middle Ages. Now, most of what I'm going to be saying is going to be in what's called the late Middle Ages. That's kind of the back end of the Middle Ages. A few things I'll mention from the high or early Middle Ages, but that's what this lecture will be about. And before I do, I got the things I'm going to tell you, which I think are fascinating. So hang in there, because if you're like, Middle Ages, who cares? Kill me now, please, with an old rusty sword like the Middle Ages. There's some fascinating things we're going to talk about. I used a bunch of different sources for my research, like I always do, but anytime I use a source a lot, I want to give a shout out for that. So there is a professor named Robert Garland. He's primarily a Greco-Roman scholar. He's written a lot. I think he's over in the UK right now. I think he was in the US and then he moved to the UK. Anyway, he's primarily a Greco-Roman scholar, but he has some research that he's done on the Middle Ages that I found super helpful. So I've mentioned some of his stuff in this lecture. Okay, let's back up. Life in the Middle Ages. Are we ready? Let's talk about what it would be like, because it was probably not great for most people. Here we go. First of all, what would it be like to be in the Middle Ages? Number one, you probably could not read. Sorry, like anything. Not just the things in Latin, which was a lot of the stuff, but you couldn't probably read at all. As late as 1500, about 90% of men and 99% of women were illiterate. Okay, so that's not great. It leads to a lot of dumbness, a lot of silliness, a lot of superstition. If you were educated, though, you were probably highly educated. So the amount of education you would get in a medieval, university is way better than today. Today, you study for a few years, get your credits, get your business degree, whatever. There, it was like living on campus, doing everything in Latin, having to debate students in class, and you would be there for forever. If you wanted to be a master or a doctor or somebody that was going to be a professor or, studied philosophy or something, you might be there for, over a decade studying for that. So the educational requirements were very high. And because you knew Latin, you could communicate with people all over Europe, which is amazing. That Latin was the lingua franca. Do we want to call it that? That Latin was the French language? That makes no sense. You know what I'm saying. That Latin was this universal language, so you could communicate with all kinds of people. So you couldn't read, but you could see a little bit better because bone eyeglasses were invented around this time, so you could maybe see things a little bit better than previous generations. Gunpowder was also introduced in Europe at this time. So it was invented earlier in China. I think it was the 9th-ish century or so, but it became popularized in Europe at this time. Life was pretty difficult, but you did get some off days. So you got to rest on a Sunday, on Sundays, because these were considered holy days where you might attend a worship service or whatever. But you also had about 50 holy days a year where you would get a day off work. Now, despite what you might expect, you probably actually had healthy teeth. So when I think of like peasants in the Middle Ages, I just think of like Monty Python teeth. They're just gross and falling out of their mouth. You probably actually had teeth that were not terrible because sugar was not widely available. Like the things we eat today that just destroy our teeth that are delicious, they don't have that because you just don't get to have very many delicious things. 5'7" was the height of the average male. Now that's 2 inches shorter than the average male in the U.S. today. The average male is only 5'9". As someone who's 6'1", I feel as though that's a bit short, but it's fine. What would you eat in the Middle Ages? If you were just a commoner, you'd probably have bread and porridge, but you might, if you were lucky, get some fish or meat on some sort of holy day. You probably have a disease called scurvy. What is scurvy? We think of that as a pirate disease. Pirates get scurvy. What is scurvy? Because citrus fruit is not readily available. You don't get enough of these nutrients that you need, so your skin becomes gross and your gums become gross and your body does a bunch of gross things. That's my definition of scurvy. Just if you want to know how much I know about medicine, the answer is scurvy makes you gross. If someone looked gross, I'd say, not a doctor, but you probably have scurvy. In the 1300s, between 10 and 25% of Europe is estimated to have died from famine. So not getting enough food to eat was like a real threat. It's not like today where you can just have food ordered to your house on your phone, which is incredible, which is why you want to live today or in the future and not in the Middle Ages. I mean, you might have entire, populations wiped out just due to famine, starving to death, which is brutal. There weren't as many people back then. Villages had about 400 people, so you would know just about everybody in your village. One of the biggest cities at this time, London, had only about 70,000 people. To put that in perspective, today they have about 9 million. So these cities and towns were much smaller than one might expect. Your house was probably this small, tiny place that was just there to really keep you out of the rain. Most houses had between 1 and 2 rooms, and that's it. And that is where your entire family lived and slept. In the winter, you might let some of your animals, maybe sheep or pigs, into the house to help keep you warm. Hygiene, you're starting to notice, was not great in the Middle Ages, as you smell of pig and these kind of things. You were probably involved in agriculture, that 90% of people are estimated to have been farmers at this time. So agriculture was a big thing. So a lot of people farmed. A lot of people farmed for their lord on his plot of land. That was one of the most common professions, though. We've actually found a higher level of arthritis in skeletons that we found from the Middle Ages in England. So you had a hard life. You're sleeping with the pigs, and you have no money, and you have scurvy, whatever this pirate disease is, and you're doing your best, and you just have arthritis because all you can do is farm your whole life. It's rough. You are under a system that is called seigneurialism. It's kind of the feudal system idea. So what happens is you have these nobles, these lords, and they live in this kind of better house than you, castle sometimes, made of stone. It's bigger, it's better, a manor perhaps. And they have land. And you work for them on the land, and it's kind of this symbiotic relationship. So the Lord provides you protection. He provides you justice if somebody has wronged you. He lets you use his land. It's his land. It doesn't belong to you. But in return, you pay him in a sense with labor. You might pay him rent. You might offer some of your harvest to him and his family. And especially you would be called to serve him in battle. If a war was happening, that was the duty that you owed your Lord. But that's how a lot of people lived. You had nobles and the clergy that are also involved kind of in that noble class. And then you had the commoners and the peasants. And the peasants work for the nobles. They benefit because they get to use the noble stuff, mainly land. They get protection, etc. And then the nobles benefit, obviously, more off of the labor of the peasants. As I said, hygiene was terrible. A king might bathe only once every 3 weeks. If you're a king, yuck. Disgusting. So again, hygiene, not great. You might be executed for petty crimes like theft. If you stole a certain amount, you could be killed for that. One of the weirder things that happened in the Middle Ages is something called trial by ordeal. If they were not sure whether or not you were guilty in some sort of, it's called a court case or whatever, they would often do something that would hurt you and see the effect. And in their mind, that was God either judging you or not. Meaning, you might walk through hot coals. You might carry around a big piece of burning iron in your hand. And then they'd watch your hand for like 3 days after. And if it became infected, you're guilty. Obviously, God hates you because your hand's infected from burning it on the metal. If it doesn't become infected, you might be innocent. So sorry about your hand, but you don't have to be executed now. You could also have small parts of your body cut off as a punishment. If you had a lenient judge that didn't want to kill you, didn't want to do capital punishment, he could cut off your nose or your ear or your testicles or something like that to teach you a lesson that you shouldn't have stolen that thing. You were probably superstitious if you lived in the Middle Ages. Belief in fairies, witches, and omens was common. Malleus Maleficarum was a book that was published in 1486. That literally means hammer of witches. And it was a guide for hunting witches. So if you get bored reading all the theology, might be one of the few things that you could read, if you could read in Latin. Now you could read about how to hunt witches. So, you get your crossbow and your crucifix and you go vampire hunting. Your barber, in addition to cutting your hair, could extract a tooth or amputate a limb. He was the town dentist and surgeon, so tip your barber well, because in the Middle Ages, he plays a lot of roles. He wears a lot of hats. Let's talk about travel. If you today want to go, let's say, from England to New York, you hop on an airplane, which is incredible. You have Wi-Fi. You're 30 to 40,000 feet up in the air, and you have Wi-Fi, and you're on your phone in air conditioning, talking to people, and the journey takes 8.5 hours. It's a long flight, but that's not bad. If you needed to travel a long distance like that in the Middle Ages, a ship could typically go only about 50 miles a day. 50 miles for an entire day. So to get from England to New York, it would take about 69 days at sea. No GPS, No radio. If you get stuck in a storm, cool. You and your family just die. I think the Mayflower took 66 days, so that's about a good estimate. That's how long you would be just to go from what is now an 8.5-hour flight while you have a drink, while you have food served to you, while you use a bathroom on a plane, while you don't get eaten by sharks or killed in some sort of hurricane. Life was tough back then. Jewish people were not as accepted in medieval Europe because of the overwhelming influence of Christendom at that time. And so one of the jobs they became proficient in. So let's talk about something that is kind of a stereotype, but is also kind of rooted in history. The Roman Catholics, which is what you would be, by the way. The only types of Christianity there was either Roman Catholic, which was the Western Church in Europe, or if you were Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. If you get further east into places like Greece and then Russia and these kind of places, you'd be Eastern Orthodox. Those two groups split in 1054, which is called the Great Schism. And you didn't get Protestantism till, 1517 is when it's considered to start, with Martin Luther nailing his 95 Thesis on the church door at Wittenberg. And so everyone was basically Roman Catholic. You were Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox if you were further east, or you were a heretic, or that was it. Now you might be a Muslim or a Jew, and then you were treated differently because you were certainly not the norm in Europe. The Roman Catholics at this time thought that lending money at interest, what they called usury, was a sin. So they allowed Jews to do it. So Jewish people became very involved and powerful in the banking industry in Europe. I guess the thinking of the Catholics was like, well, if they're going to go to hell anyway, might as well let them lend us money for our building projects or whatever. So not saying that's right, but just saying that was the thinking. So Jewish people became very involved in banking and the financial industry in Europe in the Middle Ages due to the belief in usury. You had only about a 50% chance of making it to adulthood. That's crazy. So if you have 10 kids, 5 of them will make it. It wouldn't be like today where you only have 2 kids, because then you'd only have 1 that might make it to adulthood. And then you also had one of the most awful things that ever happened disease-wise in the world, the Black Death, the bubonic plague. It had a 60 to 80% death rate. So if you got it, your chance of dying was between 60 to 80%, and it happened within a few days. It killed 1/3 of Europe, which is insane. Maybe half of people in London. It was off. I mean, so if you're listening to this after 2020, which you are because it was recorded after 2020, something with the death rate of COVID, the COVID-19 thing we went through, would not have even been considered a pandemic. The death rate was less than 1%. That would have just been considered a Tuesday in the Middle Ages. Something like the Black Death with a 60 to 80% death rate is insane. So anyway, that's going on. What would it be like to be a woman in the Middle Ages? A woman would be under the rule of some type of male her entire life, whether it be her father, whether it be her husband. If she joined a convent, she might be able to be under the authority of a woman. But even then, sometimes men were the ultimate authorities over the convents, whether it's an abbot or some type of higher-up priest or something like that. You'll definitely have an arranged marriage where there will be exchanges of goods like property and titles. Men could hit their wives if they disobeyed. Back in the Middle Ages, they thought that a woman produced seed like men do when it comes to sex. If you haven't listened to the History of Sex lecture, it's very explicit, so don't listen to it around your kids. It's adults only. I talk a little bit about the belief of how conception worked in the ancient world and in the medieval world. But they believed that women should have sex often with their husbands so that they did not get sick and die, because they thought that their seed, because they thought they had seed like men have seed, would like congeal and solidify in them, and it could make them sick or could kill them. How many kids would you have? You might have up to 14-ish kids. So your entire job is just being pregnant. Your job is to make people. Your husband's probably farming. If your husband cheats on you, you are not allowed to divorce him. You must remain married, though you were allowed to live apart. So there's a little concession for you. All forms of contraception were seen as sin, and prostitution could happen for girls as early as age 12. Again, a lot of bad things going on in the Middle Ages. Now, you need to understand a little bit about the overwhelmingly powerful influence of Roman Catholicism in Europe to understand what's going on in the Middle Ages. You can't, I've seen medievalists and I've read medievalists that kind of try to study the Middle Ages almost apart from religious views. Regardless of your religious views, I don't care. You can't study the Middle Ages that way, though, because it plays such a pivotal role in people's lives. You can't just study the Middle Ages from an economic perspective or from a literary perspective. You have to take into account religion because it's going to play a part in everybody's life, whether they want to or not. The Roman Catholic Church at this point is the most powerful institution on earth, even stronger than nations and kings, that they will get to bow before them. And so you need to understand what it would have been like to be a Roman Catholic in the Middle Ages, which is, again, the only type of Christianity available to you. Let's talk about church services in the Middle Ages. Churches were the hospitals and schools of their day. You had what was called the cathedral school, where if you wanted your son, for example, typically women didn't, but if you wanted your son to become educated, he'd typically be educated by priests or monks or these kind of things through the church. They also served as hospitals. They took care of those who were traveling, etc. You did not own a Bible. Okay, one, you couldn't afford it. They were very expensive to make. This is before the invention of the printing press. Also, it was illegal to have a Bible in your own language. So you can't afford one. You can't read one in Latin because you don't read Latin. You don't have one in your own language. And even if you did, you couldn't read your own language. So there was not a lot of personal Bible study. That's something that's going to be popularized at the Reformation, but not before. What you did probably learn was to memorize the Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, and the Nicene Creed in Latin, although you didn't know what you were saying. Now, there was a huge emphasis in the Middle Ages, and you'll still see this with a lot of famous churches in Europe, on what are called relics. Relics are these things that belong to or were touched by or were part of the body of some ancient holy person or saint, and they were thought to be holy objects that would bring you grace if you saw them or visited them or touched them. So there was a huge emphasis on religious relics. You actually could, there were a lot of people that traded in this. Churches made money off this. The Protestant reformer John Calvin once commented that he saw so many, or that there were so many pieces of the cross in these Catholic churches that there were enough to build a ship. So everyone's just claiming to have a piece of the cross and these kind of things. A relic might be something like the skull of John the Baptist, right, who was beheaded, nails from the cross, a piece of the burning bush, drops of Christ's blood, the spear that pierced Christ's side, or even breast milk from the Virgin Mary. And what's interesting is so many churches, for example, are claiming to have the nails from the cross. I mean, there's not very many of them, but a lot of churches claim to have them. So it became kind of this abused trade that happened in the Middle Ages. Most of the church service, you would kneel. What about the pews? Pews didn't become popularized till about the 15th century. So you would kneel, but you would stand when the gospel was being read. Men and women would sit in separate places in the church, either the men up front and the women further back, or the men on one side and the woman on the other side. And the main focus of the service was partaking of the Eucharist. One of the things that'll change in the Reformation is that the main focus becomes preaching. And so they put the pulpit in the center of the stage, and that becomes the focus. But before that, the main focus is partaking of the Eucharist. So what would happen is you would not understand the service because the service would all be in Latin. You don't speak Latin. And you would go up and you would kneel before a rail as if to separate you and the clergy. The clergy's awesome. They're closer to God. You're just the gross laity and you're gross sleeping with pig stuff and you're not bathing and such. And you would kneel and there'd be a railing to say there's a separation between the clergy and you. And you weren't allowed to take the wine in communion. In Roman Catholicism, they believe that the wine and the bread literally, materially become the body and blood of Jesus, like his O negative blood. I don't know what blood type he has. And the wafers become his skin. You're not allowed to have the blood because you might spill it. We don't want to spill Jesus on the floor. And what you would do is you'd open your mouth and you wouldn't reach out for it. They would put that little wafer or that little piece of bread on your tongue and you would let it dissolve. Why? Because you don't want to chew the baby Jesus. And so that would be communion. Stained glass may be the only imagery you would ever see in your lifetime. Perhaps the only imagery you would ever see in your lifetime would be in the church. It was almost a way to teach illiterate people via picture book. You could look at these biblical stories because you couldn't read them. We come across more images in one day than someone in the Middle Ages would have their entire life. They don't have TV. They don't have these magazines and print books that they can just flip through. They stay in their town. You see more images when you scroll through social media in one day than they would their entire life, which is crazy. The church, though, did all the religious stuff for you, okay? You went through the priest, you went through the church. There wasn't a way to go to God apart from the church. This will be something that becomes a point of contention later on after the Middle Ages. But that was there wasn't a way of you saying, okay, I'm going to be a Christian, I'm going to approach God, but I don't need the church. You need the church. A common phrase in the Middle Ages, nobody can have God as his father who does not have the church as his mother. And the church was not a great place spiritually, morally, in the late Middle Ages. Martin Luther describes monasteries as lice-infested dens of homosexuality. Many monks had secret concubines and sexual liaisons with nuns. None can't get none. Apparently she can. Even popes had mistresses, you know? Listen, he's a man. I don't care how holy he is. He's a man. And Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus, one of the great humanist scholars, one of the greatest Latin and Greek scholars of all time, was the son of a priest. Your dad could be a carpenter. Your dad could be a banker. Your dad's not supposed to be a priest because priests aren't allowed to marry. But anyway, that was Erasmus. Around the year 1409, you had three men all claiming to be the Pope. There was a church in Europe that had an 8-year-old boy leading the parish. A lot of times church offices were sold and bought. It's called simony. That happened a lot. In some places in Germany, only 1 in 14 churches had an actual pastor. In some churches in Switzerland, priests hadn't even read the entire New Testament, the little small part of the Bible, not the big old part. And what you need to know in the Middle Ages is the church and state are not separate. Like, we think of separation of church and state as like the norm now because we live in, modern democratic republics or whatever where people have freedom of religion. That was not the norm. There was no such thing in their mind as a separation of church and state. How would you make laws? If you're going to make laws, would those either be Christian or not Christian? You're picking one. You're picking some sort of religious allegiance, one way or the other. There's no such thing as just a neutral government, and they realized that, and so there wasn't a separation of church and state. And oftentimes, the state was subject to the church. The church at this time holds overwhelming power. The church will call for the Crusades. The church can tell kings to kneel before them and do what they say, or else they will excommunicate them and their entire nation. I think it's called an interdict when they do that. So it's pretty crazy. The crown, for example, worn by Pope Boniface VIII, had 48 rubies, 72 sapphires, 45 emeralds, and 66 large pearls. It also had 2 gold rows showing that he was in charge of the church and the state. And then one of the more interesting things in medieval history, in 1077, a guy named Hildebrand, Pope Gregory VII, made the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, stand outside his castle in Canossa barefoot for 3 days in the snow before he would lift his excommunication. Think about how powerful you are to be able to do that. If you're the Pope and you excommunicate the Holy Roman Emperor, like the guy over Europe, he makes the Holy Roman Emperor stand barefoot 3 days in the snow before he will forgive him. That's how powerful you are if you are part of the church. It is an overwhelmingly powerful institution, and that stranglehold will not be broken until a foul-mouthed, lewd, often drunk German monk named Martin Luther, we've got a lecture, I think, on Luther, will change things, which will eventually lead to the Enlightenment. That's not Luther's goal, but that's where it will go. So anyway, that's what's going on in the Middle Ages. Crazy, crazy time to live. Fascinating things. Let's talk about one of the things that would have dominated your thought, though, and this is kind of sad, but it would have dominated your thought in the Middle Ages, which was the fear of hell. This is you're waking your whole life, even if you were especially a pious person, whether you trusted in Jesus, whether you had partaken of the church's sacraments, whatever it was, you would still be terrified of going to hell. And hell was often taught in very explicit terms. I want to mention something from Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante Alighieri, his Divine Comedy, specifically his Inferno. He describes hell as having 9 levels or circles. You might have heard that, like the 7th circle of hell. And he goes into detail describing what these kind of things are. Now, by the way, there's certainly much more terrible and graphic views of hell given elsewhere than Dante, but this is just kind of a very popular. You've got mythology kind of mixed with scary, mixed with preaching, mixed with what's biblical, and this was just kind of the popular understanding. And Dante obviously popularized this. But let's talk about the different levels of hell in the Inferno. The first circle of hell, it includes moral pagans. Great, that's helpful. I like Aristotle. I like Plato. We need these moral pagans. And it includes unbaptized Christians. Okay, it's limbo. It's not really hell yet, but people just wander around in loneliness. So on each level, it talks about the kind of people that go there and what sins they commit, and then what they have to endure because of that. The second level of hell, lust. Oh, good. I mean, at least lust gets the second level. It doesn't get the ninth level. That's great for most people. People are blown in a continual windstorm. That's the punishment for lust. Not that bad. Number 3, the third level or circle of hell, gluttony. People are freezing in a continual icy rain. Ooh, so you better cut back. Better cut back on the fast food. You don't want to be in a continual icy rain. Number 4, or the fourth level, greed. People are forced to push big boulders around. Sounds a little myth of Sisyphus. Doesn't sound too terrible. Maybe you get stronger. Who knows? Number 5, anger. People are engaged in an endless battle in a swamp. I just love how creative that is. Being engaged in an endless battle, that's not great. But in a swamp, dude, oh gosh, your socks are wet and it's humid probably. And I just don't want to, that moss gets stuck to you. I don't want to control your anger. Number 6, heresy. People are burned forever in stone coffins. Well, that just jumped up a bunch. We went from like wind and loneliness to burning in a coffin. Heresy's a bad deal. The 7th layer of hell for those who committed unrighteous violence. People are made to drown in a lake of boiling blood. Holy shit, what is happening? It's just gotten terrible. Number 8, the 8th level, fraud. People are endlessly tortured by being beaten by demons. That seems less bad than drowning in a lake of boiling blood, but it's fine. And then the 9th circle, the worst circle, treachery. It's a vast frozen lake where the devil resides with the worst sinners, people like Judas. And so many of these are based on Dante's ideas of the 7 deadly sins. You've probably seen that. If you've never seen the movie Seven, what a great movie. It's kind of based on this idea, but the 7 deadly sins being pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. So this is what life would be like in the Middle Ages. It was not great, although there was a lot of academic and intellectual flourishing and even a lot of flourishing in the arts. It's not technically the Dark Ages, but man, you have got to be thankful. I mean, you're listening or watching this podcast. Think about all the technology involved here. There are lights we have. If I have a blister, I don't die from it. I can just get some medicine. We can fly on airplanes. I can take out my phone, my magic space phone, and I can look at it, and it sends a signal to a satellite in space. I don't know. And then it bounces to somebody else's magic space phone, and we can talk to each other on the other end of the world, and it doesn't take 69 days to get from Europe to here. It just happens in a few seconds. It's really, really incredible. So that's life in the Middle Ages. Thanks for joining me, as always, on Ideological.